Hello, my name is Tom Leslie. I'm the curator of a display at the Heritage Discovery Center in Johnstown, Pennsylvania called A Steelworker Story. It's a display that features artifacts and stories from the Johnstown plant. We're in the vestibule of the Discovery Center in Johnstown on Broad Street. To my left, you'll see a display that was on the observation deck for the 12-inch mill in the Gautier Division. We were able to save that display, rehabilitate it, and it tells the story of how the Johnstown area was the founder of the steelmaking processes and also the rolling mills, with the first 3-high rolling mill invented in the Johnstown area. To my right, we have a mill entrance sign that was retrieved from the Johnstown wheel plant. It was the last existing Bethlehem steel sign in the area. We were fortunately able to retrieve it and save it. It is now under roof and it will be here for years and years to come. We're now inside the Heritage Discovery Center Steel Museum, and we are at the title board of A Steelworker Story. This is a brief history of the Johnstown plant from its inception in 1854 till its closure in 1992. It tells a little bit of the story of the plant, different facts about the plant, and we move on down to a Bethlehem Steel flag, which was normally attached to the rear of cargo that was hanging outside the bed of a long bed truck. There was many of them. Some of them would say steel pipe, but a lot of them just said Bethlehem Steel. This happens to be a brand new one that was never used, so it's nice and bright for our collection. Down from here we have the lunchbox, and this is one of my only required reading parts of the display. It basically sets the tone for the museum and the display, telling about the idea behind the lunchbox, that just about everybody that worked in the Johnstown plant, from the most dreaded conditions in steelmaking through the air-conditioned offices of the general offices in downtown, almost everybody carried a lunchbox to work, and this tells the story of that. We're now at the union section of the display. The Johnstown plant was a union shop with the United Steelworkers of America. In the early days, when the unions first made their entrance into the Johnstown plant, it was still old school. Wherever the boss told you what to do, you didn't question it, you did what he told you to do. Later on in the plant, we began with labor management participation teams, which took input from the worker that was actually doing the job to try to make the job more efficient and to get a better quality product. With this display board, you can see that this was at a local union hall, and the wire mill is listed. General Telephone, I'm not quite sure when they changed from General Telephone to the other companies that now exist, but General Telephone was a big union shop. The Franklin Division, Conemaugh Blacklick, the wheel plant, and a secondary Conemaugh Blacklick union meeting was on the fourth Wednesday of each month. Up towards the top, you'll see different cups, and they were labor management participation teams. So the group of employees that were interacting with management, trying to come up with better, more efficient ways of making steel, or a cleaner process, or safety concerns in the plant. They took the input from the workers for the labor management participation teams, and different bumper stickers that really championed the workers and their input into that process. We have a trouble light on display that I always kind of liked because it was an interesting light. It was a 220 volt trouble light with open terminals, and you can imagine electricians and people working in the plant. It's raining, they're outside, they're using open terminals with 220 volts plugged into a wooden plug to get lighting onto whatever they're repairing. Once the unions and the safety issues became more apparent, these types of things were done away with, and more safety-oriented trouble lights were brought in. But this is kind of different, showing that it actually had open terminals that the men were using. We're now at a display called Milestones in Metallurgy, and this is a storyboard of the Johnstown plant. Across the top of the storyboard, you see different plaques, and on either side of it, of the Bethlehem Steel symbol, is a commemorative plaque that was handed out in 1958 for a mechanical tour that took place in the Johnstown plant. The center emblem normally came off of machines. Bethlehem would put their logo onto different types of machines that were used in the plant. Down below that, we have a section from the Cambria Iron Company, which was 1855 to 1867, a piece of Cambria steel rail that was 1889, and then a section of small gauge rail from the 14-inch mill. The wheel up on the top of the clock, that was made from a picture of the last wheel that was produced in the Johnstown wheel plant. It was a 40-inch wheel, and our last wheel was produced on September 14, 1978. The yellow shipping tag was from the wire mill. The wire mill used to be called the rod and wire mill, and it had a 3-strand rod mill that was the only 3-strand mill operating in the Johnstown plant. A yellow shipping tag meant that it was a leaded heat. We produced leaded steel 24/7 in the Johnstown plant, and we were one of the last plants to continue to produce lead. On a leaded heat, you will always see a heat number on these bars, and a leaded heat would always have a number 5 as the 3rd digit. The first digit on a heat number, when a customer called to order steel for maybe Goodyear rim or a product that he was producing, it would be assigned a type of metallurgical heat number. And the Johnstown plant was always the number 6 plant. The next set of numbers was the number of the furnace that was going to produce that heat. The next was the series of the heat, and the next was the number of heats that had been produced in that series. So as we see the yellow shipping tag, this was off of the last heat to come through the 10-inch rod mill. It's typical that you commemorate a last bar or a last rod or the end of a steelmaking process or the beginning of a new process with handing out souvenir bars to the employees. This was the last heat produced for the 10-inch rod mill on December 21st, 1989. This is the size of the bar as it came out of the furnace into the rolling mill. This is the size of that same bar as it went through number 9 mill stand. This would have been coming out of number 15 mill stand, and this was a sample for snap-on wrench. And you can see that it has a raw stamping of a wrench that would later be refined and cut out of that section. This sample is from the 14-inch mill. In 1981, the open hearth process of steelmaking ended in Johnstown, and we began the new electric furnace melt shop. Less than 30 days after this heat was produced, we started up the electric furnace melt shop. So the last open hearth heat in the Johnstown plant was on August 22nd, 1981. An open hearth furnace is a rectangular furnace. So the 14-inch rolled their last bar of open hearth steel is a rectangle. Electric furnace is a round vessel, and so the first heat, again, Johnstown plant, number 10 electric furnace, series P, started over again at number 1. You can see less than 30 days later, on September 16th, 1981, the 14-inch mill rolled its first heat of electric furnace steel. This is an octagon sample from the Gautier mills. It was produced in April 21st of 1988. This was the last bar to come through as we were shutting down in 1992, the closure of the Johnstown plant. The 14-inch mill, this was Davis brake beam. This was the last bar produced from the 14-inch mill, and it was rolled on August 28, 1992. The last bar from our 12-inch mill was produced on September 9th of 1992. And you hear me talking about the inches of the mill. Basically, the larger the number of the mill, the bigger piece of steel it can handle, the more inches in the name of the steel. So the 46-inch mill was our big ingot breakdown mills in Johnstown, and as we go into smaller and smaller products, you'll see the inch size of the mill come down to 14-inch mills and then down to 12-inch mills. This was our last fence post that we rolled in the Johnstown plant, and that would have been rolled in the late 50s. This is a sample of the last Goodyear rim section, and this would have been a split rim for people that remember when rims came in 2 pieces. This would have been a smaller rim, maybe for a small farm implement or some smaller item, and this was the sister companion piece that would lock into this and form the circle that went around to lock the tire onto the rim. This was the last Goodyear that was rolled on August 20th, 1992, and this was rolled in the 9-inch number 2 mill on September 15th, 1992. This was the last piece of bead lock, they called it, that was rolled. This is a geometry test. Basically, geometry tests were sent to the lab. They were machined down into something that looked like this. And they were put into a machine. They were machined to certain calipers and sizes, and then they were pulled apart by a machine that would test how much strength it took to break this piece to see that it was on grade. This piece actually came from the axle plant of Johnstown, and at one time the axle plant produced 80% of all the axles produced in the world came from the Johnstown plant. This same geometry looked like this in its raw form before it was machined into that small barbell looking item. The 13-inch Lackawanna plant rolled all the steel for our 13-inch bar mill in Lackawanna in the bar rod and wire division. So our steel was made in Johnstown, shipped up to Lackawanna, New York. This is a commemorative last section of bar that was rolled in the 13-inch bar mill in the Lackawanna plant. Underneath the geometry is the last bar that came from the 11-inch rod mill. And our 11-inch mill was our most automated mill in the Johnstown plant. It could roll at 40 feet a second. It was our fastest mill. It was built in 1962, and its last bar was rolled on September 16th, 1992 at 12:30. This was our most popular last bar because they actually made the last bar, last roll impregnated with the name that says last bar and the date from the 11-inch mill. We had two plate mills in the Johnstown plant. We had a 134-inch big plate mill in the Franklin division, and it began rolling in 1902. This is a sample from the last plate that was ever rolled from the Johnstown plate mill. It came out of number 54 open hearth furnace, and the plate mill shut down on July 14, 1976. The other plate mill that we had was in the Gautier Division, and it was the 36-inch plate mill, and it rolled the sides for the freight car division. We were one of the few plants that could start with raw materials and turn out a finished freight car. Again, 34-inch mill, now we're rolling bigger materials in the 34-inch mill. Johnstown plant, number 20 furnace, this was an electric furnace piece, again the first P001, and this was put through on September 23rd, 1981. The last open hearth to go through the 21-inch mill was again Johnstown plant. 59 furnace was the last open hearth furnace in Johnstown to tap out. P series, 239 heats in the series. Here's another one out of the 21-inch mill, and this was again the first Johnstown plant, number 10 furnace, P series 001, and this rolled through the 21-inch mill on 9/16/1981. The last bar to come through the Johnstown plant of recently produced steel was on July 31st, 1992. This is coming through the 21-inch mill. Now, after the plant ceased steel production, we had a lot of steel still laying on the ground. It was called banked heats. So if they had missed a grade of steel and they couldn't sell that particular heat because they didn't have a customer that ordered that grade of heat, that we would bank the heat. We would put it on the ground, save it till when a customer ordered that particular grade. We would pick it back up off the ground, put it in the soaking pits, and roll it through the mills. And the very last heat to roll through the rolling mills was on August 5th, 1992. The samples were so popular, this was normally a 6x6 piece. It has the heat number and the date that it was rolled, but it was so popular that we were only able to get a slice of that because they had run out of samples and they were slicing it down into fourths and fifths of a bar to hand out. Going up to the top, after the open hearth production ended, an open hearth furnace requires, you're making steel. You need coke, you need iron, you need raw materials to make steel. The electric furnaces were melt shops. We were melting down scrap. We were melting down structural and automobiles to make steel in an electric furnace. But in the open hearth steelmaking process, you need coke. Our coke plant continued after the blast furnaces shut down. We were selling it to other plants. This is a sample from the last push of coke out of the Franklin division on 4/29/1982. This was out of number 83 oven and number 18 battery. When you blow a blast furnace in, at one point the Johnstown plant had 7 operational blast furnaces in production. When you blow a blast furnace in, that means you're starting that furnace for the very first time. It's a big deal. A lot of dignitaries come to watch the lighting of this furnace because you just spent millions and millions of dollars either building the furnace or relining the furnace. This was a blow-in test. Our blast furnaces used to have a number. Somewhere in the 60s they changed it to letters. But this was from number 5 blast furnace, and it was blown in by a gentleman named E.O. Murray. This is a commemorative sample from that heat that was on February 7th, 1935. Again, later on they had letters. They changed, so if it was H blast furnace, that was the old number 8 furnace. This was G blast furnace. This was a sister furnace to H furnace. G and H furnaces were together. K and L blast furnaces was together in Franklin, and J furnace was in the middle. In Lower Cambria, we had E and F blast furnace, and E was a manganese furnace. At one point, we were the only producer of manganese in the United States. A blast furnace can make manganese or iron. It's very hard to make manganese out of a blast furnace, but we were able to do it, and we supplied the nation in manganese production. A blast furnace test normally looks like this. It'll have a wing on it, and if you produce something called white iron, it's very, very hard. The metallurgical department will crack the wing off of it, they'll pulverize it and test it. Normally what they do when they get a test, and you can see this has a G in it, even though it's inverted, they will crack the test in half and take samples out of the middle to analyze to make sure the iron's on grade for what the customer needs in that heat of steel. This was a commemorative plaque that was from the last iron ever tapped out of the Johnstown plant. So we started producing iron way prior to even Cambria steel in iron furnaces around the area. But this is the absolute last iron to ever be produced at the Johnstown plant on August 22nd, 1981, and it coincides with the shutdown of the open hearth process. An interesting story on this sample. This was out of H furnace again, the last iron ever to come out of Johnstown. And if you look at it, you'll see that it's not a fully formed test like this test is. This test was lacking a certain amount of iron in it. And basically you had a mold on the floor. The second helper would dip into the stream of iron. He would pour it into the test, and then he would knock it out of the form and send it to the lab for analysis. When H furnace was shutting down, the dignitaries from Bethlehem, PA came into Johnstown to watch this massive blast furnace produce its last cast of iron. And they came into the second helper and they said to him, we're from Bethlehem, PA, and they're all dressed very nicely, and they said, we will take the last sample of iron back to Bethlehem with us. And the gentleman was kind of a salty character, and he said, I will have the last iron out of this furnace. I second helped this furnace for 25 years. This last iron's going home with me. And they said, well, we're sure it'll go home with us. So he had 2 test molds. He reached into the stream and he poured their test and he kicked it over towards where they were standing. The stream of iron had already ceased to come out of the furnace. It was done. The last cast had taken place. He reached in with a test spoon that looked like this, and he was barely able to get enough iron to make this test. So this is absolutely the last iron to come out of any furnace in the Johnstown area for Bethlehem Steel. And that's the story on why this is not a fully formed test. But it did go home with him, so he was right. Again, a geometry test underneath it, and again, geometry test can look like this. These are poured on the pouring floors in a 2-piece mold that would be clamped together. You pour it with one of these test spoons of a sample that's coming out of the ladle, and then again it's sent to the machine shop for machining and testing for its strength. This was called a Vickers test, and I know the camera can't pick it up, but there's a fine line of tiny dots at the point of this, and the dots are shot in with a BB, and it is a very meticulous test, and it's the most exacting test, and they didn't do it very often, but we're fortunate enough to have one. And the depth of these tiny marks would be measured to see how hard this steel actually was. And again, this did not happen very often, so we are fortunate to have it. This is called a lollipop test, and lollipop tests can be in several different fashions, but this was called a 2-pin lollipop test. And again, it was a 2-piece mold clamped together. They would take the sample, pour it down in the funnel of the mold, take the clamp off, it would come apart, and this would go to the lab, and they would test different sections of this lollipop test. This is the first heat to ever be tapped out of the Franklin Division. In 1898, the Cambria Steel Company bought the Franklin tract of land and began to build the most modern steel mill in the world in Franklin, Pennsylvania, with the longest row of open hearth furnaces in the world. On April 20th, 1901, they lit the first furnace of the brand new Franklin Division, and they tapped out their first heat of steel out of the open hearth department. This is it. This is the Franklin Open Hearth Plant, first heat, April 20th, 1901. This was in the dresser drawer of the head of the metallurgical department, supervisor for Cambria Steel Company for over 130 years. We are very fortunate to have that. Once the electric furnace production started up, we became more and more refined with specialty steel. Johnstown always did produce specialty heats. We didn't produce junk here. Everything that we produced was for automotive, it was for aircraft, it was for military. We were the best of the best in the Johnstown plant. During the $110 million electric furnace project, later on we put in a ladle reheat furnace. We put in a degasser. We were making the best of the best steel in the world in the Johnstown plant, the cleanest steel. This is a sample from the ladle furnace when we started it up in 1989 in March. That's a test, a lollipop test, and this is from the degasser. This was our last degasser test on July 31st. Again, the end of steelmaking in the Johnstown plant, 1992. This test was taken at 11:20 a.m. It came out of number 10 electric furnace. We had 2 furnaces in the electric melt shop. In the open hearth shop, we had the longest row of open hearths that began at number 41 furnace and went up to number 62 furnace. When the electric melt shop started, we had 2 150-ton vessels, and these were the best of the best steel in the world. The lollipop test, again, it would be machined. It would have a spectral analysis done, and that's what these burn marks that you'll see on these lower tests. These were done, and then the test would be cut apart, and sections would be tested for nitrogen, tested for carbon and sulfur. Usually the end section was discarded. On our last day of production, I ran the stockyard crane for number 10 electric furnace. We tapped out first. 20 tapped out after us. The last steel to come out of the Johnstown plant, Bethlehem Steel, was tapped out of number 20 furnace on July 31st, 1992. It came out of number 20 furnace. It tapped at 12:55 p.m. It came off the degasser at 2:05. There's normally 16 to 17 ingots in a heat. This was the last ingot test from number 16 ingot, and this would have been the very last test, probably coming out of what they called the butt if they couldn't fill up a complete ingot. This would have been the last test ever taken at the Johnstown plant, again on July 31st, 1992, at 3:32 p.m. 130 years of steelmaking ends in the Johnstown plant. This is a test spoon, and this is what they call a skull. And basically, after you poured your test, whether you're pouring one of these, or you're pouring one of these, or a Jomny test, whatever steel is left in the skull, you would knock it out. And normally it would fall off the pouring floor down into the pit. We were lucky enough to have the first test spoon skull taken from number 10 furnace on September 16th, 1981. And we have the last of that iron test spoon skull that came from the last iron ever out of the Johnstown plant. These test spoons would come sometimes with very long handles if they had to reach into the furnace. Sometimes they were shorter handles if they were just held under the stream when the steel pourer was pouring the heat on the pouring floors. Normally there were 3 to 4 people pouring a heat. You had your metallurgical observer that was taking all the information, especially if it was a lead heat. If we poured a leaded heat, again, always had a number 5 in place of the second furnace digit. And he would have a whistle and a stopwatch. And when we would go from mold to mold, the stream would open, he'd be timing it, he'd blow the whistle, and we had what they called a lead gun that was attached over an overhead trolley, and we would turn the lead gun on, and it would shoot a stream of lead into the steel. He was timing it, he'd blow the whistle, you shut off the lead gun, you move to the next heat. This was a very dangerous thing to do. Lead was a very, very bad thing, and in the early days there wasn't good respirators or good evacuation. a lot of these lead fumes came off. Later on in the plant, through the union helping, we started testing for lead contamination in our blood, and if it got too high, we had to go for chelation, and basically cleanation, it would clean our blood of lead, but then you were never allowed around lead again because you would absorb it that much faster once you had chelated for lead. The next display we have is called the Shoes Never Worn. And it has a pair of safety shoes that were never worn, and the story of why those shoes were never worn. The story is of a gentleman named William Gabriel, and he worked at a track hopper facility called the ore bins. And basically it was an elevated ore bin system where the Conemaugh Black Lick Railroad, which was Johnstown's servicing railroad, would push the hopper cars up onto the top of the ore bins. The gates on the bottoms of the cars were opened up, and the ingredients were put into the appropriate bins. Underneath this was where the open hearth charger boxes came in on another smaller railroad, and they would fill the charger boxes up for later charging into the open hearth furnaces. And there was what they called a shaker crane that was above these gondola cars. And the shaker crane made a lot of racket, but it would get onto it would come down onto the car and rattle the car so that the ingredients was always shaking down into the chutes to go into the ore bins. One particular day, this gentleman had 33 years service. He came to work as normal, but the shaker crane was broken down. But he worked and opened up the gates on the bottoms of the car and began to empty the cargo into the appropriate bins. What he didn't realize is that half the car had gotten wet the previous day and frozen. So only half of the car was emptying out, and he was unaware that that was happening. He thought the entire contents were emptying. Once the car became so unbalanced, it immediately rolled over and crushed William Gabriel. Again, with 33 years service, that morning he told his wife, "Go to town and get me a new pair of safety shoes. My shoes are worn out and I need a new pair for work." She went to Tom McCann on Main Street in Johnstown, got a new pair of safety shoes, and he never came home to get them. These are the shoes never worn. We're now at the railroad display for the Johnstown plant. The Johnstown plant had two railroads. It had the Conemaugh Black Lick Railroad, which was the standard gauge servicing railroad for the Johnstown plant, and then we had a lot of internal railroads that shifted ingots throughout the Steelmaking Division, worked in the stockyards, worked in Gautier, moving billets to and from the rolling mills. Along the top of this, basically a cup that was a different railroads that Bethlehem owned with their insignias on it, a railroad spike from the National Museum of Transportation. In Bethlehem, it does say company on it. Bethlehem was incorporated into a corporation in 1904. This is a display that a gentleman named William Hudak made after his retirement. This is a track lock. You would lock different switches so railroad cars weren't pushed into an area that you were working on the track or servicing something, and this was his track lock and his key. Around the outside of this are date nails. On every railroad tie there was normally a brass or a steel date nail, mostly brass, and they had a date on it so that you knew when that railroad tie was put into service. And they start back up into the 1920s, 1925, and it goes into 1946 or 1947. So this was kind of interesting. He made this when he retired. Over to the left of that is an old style called a heart-shaped lock, and this was also a track lock, but it's a very, very old one made of brass. Above that is a builder plate. You'll find on different locomotive engines and different train parts, they have builder plates on them that designate who built the railroad car, what the date of the build was. This was from a ladle transport car from 1918. And a ladle transport car was a car that was used to ship full ladles that held the 150 ton of steel to go down to the machine shop if it needed a new trunnion and couldn't be serviced in the actual steelmaking department. It was moved by way of a ladle transport car. We have a helmet from Conemaugh Black Lick. We have different patches that was handed out to the guys from the Conemaugh Black Lick, and then also coming down we have different sizes of railroad spikes. The Conemaugh Black Lick employees, most employees had a brass check to get it into the mill. The Conemaugh Conemaugh Blacklick Railroad had a triangular check. This was also Conemaugh Blacklick tool check. Different pictures from the servicing engine house down in the west end of Johnstown. Different guys that would work on the engine, service them, keeping them operating. In 1976 was the bicentennial in America, and the Conemaugh Blacklick crew painted up an engine, says 76 on it. They painted it in red, white, and blue, and you can see a builder plate right there on the engine. This is that builder plate that you're looking at. That engine was built in September of 1950. In 1950 was a very significant year in Johnstown. The Johnstown plant changed from steam-powered engines over to diesel-powered locomotives, and it was a big, big expenditure in Johnstown, but this is one of the first of the engines that were produced in 1950 to replace the steam engines. This is the oil can that was off of that engine, also painted to match the red, white, and blue theme. Coming down from that, we have a builder plate from Gautier, and it was off a small steamer built by the Vulcan Iron Works. Vulcan Iron Works was out of Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania, and they built small internal switchers for the plant. This is a nice heavy-duty cast plate, and this came off a 1941 build date on a Vulcan locomotive. Different oil cans again from the Johnstown plant for the Railroads Division. A pay stub that was found in the wall of a Johnstown house, and it basically tells it's July 29th, 1948. This gentleman's name was Tex Winston, and it was found in the wall of a Johnstown house, and it does state that it's Conemaugh Blacklick Railroad, and this was probably where he would keep his time on in and out of the plant, and I guess they turned him in at that point on the amount of time that they were working. And it also has different things about allowable hours and actual hours worked and on to this. So it was probably some sort of timesheet. Below that is a list of sidings, and this is a very old one because inside this book it does talk about the Bessemer converter sidings, and that was in the very infancy of the Johnstown plant when we had the Bessemer converters. So it's a very, very old Conemaugh Blacklick book. This is the story of my grandfather's death. His name was Hetrick Miller, and on September 22nd of 1920, he was a brakeman on a steam locomotive that was bringing a load of cars up from the downtown Johnstown towards Franklin. Coming down at 4 o'clock in the morning on the same track was a fully loaded train, and they met head-on. They were on the same track at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it led to my grandfather's instant demise. I do have his pocket watch that stopped at 4 o'clock in the morning. This is a picture of my grandfather, and again, this was one of the worst tragedies in the Johnstown plant, and this year, in the year of 2020, we will be at the 100th anniversary of his death. Different railroad spikes, different handles that came off of locomotives. This was a brake handle from an internal switcher locomotive in the Johnstown plant. In steelmaking, we had both standard gauge locomotives down, or up into the stockyard division. Into the pit and mold yard division, we had narrow gauge locomotives. But this is the builder plate off this exact engine, and this engine was produced in July of 1950. Again, everything was changing from steam to diesel in 1950. So this is the builder plate, July 1950. This is the serial number of the engine, and this is off of General Electric diesel electric locomotive that was used in the steelmaking division. Again, a picture of my grandfather, and this is a brake handle that was off of one of the narrow gauge engines that was used down in the pit level, mold yard level of the Johnstown plant. Different lanterns, brakemen using lanterns at night. This is actually my lantern. When I was hired in April 18th, 1974, I was hired into the railroad unit. This was my braking lantern that I was assigned, and I was a brakeman for Bethlehem Steel until the flood of 1977 hit. I could no longer hold on to the railroad unit because we had gone down to 4 open hearth furnaces, and I had bid into the crane unit and began running crane after the 77 flood was over, and we started operations back up again. Below the railroad display, we have a schematic of a piece of Cambria steel rail and a piece that actually is a Cambria steel rail that was rolled in May of 1886. Next to that, we have one of the last Bethlehem steel steam engine bells that was used by the Conemaugh Blacklick engine company, and it was awarded to us by a gentleman that had worked at the Conemaugh Blacklick Roundhouse on the last day of his retirement in 1950. Again, when they were scrapping out all the steam engines and going to diesels, he put in a request for one of the last Bethlehem steel steam engine bells. That is it. When you look at that bell closely, you can see how worn it is. A lot of the places that probably should have been greased often was not greased in the trunnions, and it is really egg-shaped out. So that bell was used quite a bit, but we are so fortunate to have one of the last Bethlehem steel steam engine bells that was used. The next display we have is the steelmaking display. This was my home unit. This is where I was hired into the plant, and this is where I spent just about my entire career in this plant. Up at the top of the board, we start with the Koch Division, and when the open hearth furnaces were operating, again, you need coke, you need iron, you need the open hearth furnaces to make your steel. The Koch plant was a very dangerous place to work. We have different samples of coke, we have different brass tags from the mines that fed the coke plants, because you do need metallurgical grade coal to produce good coke. A coke oven contains 18 tons of coal. The coking time for that is 18 hours and 20 minutes, and it yields 11 tons of coke. This is a rare sample. Most coke is black. This is a rare sample of red coke that would come out of the Rosedale coke ovens every now and again. We had two sets of coke ovens. We had number 15 and 16 coke battery down in the Rosedale part of the Johnstown plant, which was the first modern coke ovens in America. In Franklin was our newer ovens, and they were number 16, 17, and 18 batteries in the Franklin division. There was a job called sealing lids, and when you sealed lids, a machine would come and it would fill the coke ovens with coal, and then there was lids that had to be put back on top where the coal had entered into the ovens, and you had to take and move the lids back over, and it was very hot up there. You had to wear some type of wooden shoe, and they even at one point tried a steel shoe. If you wore your regular steel-toed shoes, you would melt the soles off of them. So everybody had to strap on wooden shoes to work up on top of these furnaces. That's how hot it was, and the job was called sealing lids. This is a oven door off of number 73 oven from the Franklin division, and this is a pattern. These were used in the foundry to make different parts. The reason we included this is a very old one from the Rosedale coke plant, and we'll explain later on what patterns were used for and how they were made. But this is an old one from the Rosedale coke plant for the Cambria Steel Company. Different types of passes that was given to maybe visitors coming into the plant, and this is a pass from August 8, 1921, and the time and the date that they were allowed to stay in from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. in the plant. Coming down, we also have what they call a door scraper, and this was in the Rosedale plant. They were older coke ovens, so they did not have self-sealing doors. Those doors had to be mudded shut after every push of coke came out of the ovens. So they would close the doors and they would take mud and they would seal them with mud, and then after the coke was pushed out, they had to clean the old mud off. This is actually a scraper from the Rosedale division. Again, Franklin had self-sealing doors. That wasn't a necessary operation there. We go down into the blast furnace department, and this is a pyrometer from 1955, and this would be hooked to a machine that would register how much heat was coming through the vessel of a blast furnace, and that way they would know how much refractory was left inside that furnace. If the outside of the shell of the blast furnace is getting too hot, they know that the inside of the furnace is wearing out. So this is what this pyrometer did. This is our blast furnaces. Again, at one point we had 5 operational blast furnaces in Franklin, 2 blast furnaces in Lower Cambria. This is a slag sample out of K blast furnace, which was a sister to L blast furnace. Those ran together. J blast furnace was in the middle, and towards Franklin was a G and H blast furnace. L and H were the two big furnaces. G and K were smaller furnaces. And J furnace in the middle, it was pulled out many years ago. No one is really surviving that can tell us much about the size of J blast furnace. This is manganese from E blast furnace, which was a sister with F blast furnace down in Lower Cambria. Again, the only manganese producer in the United States was E blast furnace. If you needed additional iron to a heat, we would load with a small pig iron, and you would take a magnet full of these and you would put them into the charger boxes, and they would charge them into the furnaces if a heat required additional iron. You get into the open hearth department, and one last section on the blast furnace story is this is a builder plate from Koppers. Koppers is headquartered in Pittsburgh, right by the U.S. Steel Tower. So if you're on home plate at the Pirate Stadium and you're looking out over center field, you'll see a building out there below the U.S. Steel building that has the word Koppers on it. Koppers built most of the coke plants and blast furnaces in the eastern United States. When they were building their national headquarters, they wanted to be in the thick of the industry, so they built their national headquarters in Pittsburgh, and that Koppers building is still there today. This is L blast furnace coming down. After steelmaking had ended in the open hearth process, they were scrapping out the blast furnaces and all the steelmaking facilities, from the sindering plants to the coke ovens. We were melting them down in the electric furnace department. Congressman Murtha had designated Franklin a National Historic Landmark, and the problem is we were trying to keep 2,000 employees working in the Johnstown plant, so this was free steel. It was free scrap for us to melt down, so nobody seemed to mind as we scrapped out a National Historic Landmark. To this side, this is a sample from L blast furnace, and this was taken from the roof of the open hearth department. Remember, it was Cambria Steel that built the open hearth department back in 1898. So this is a sample of angle that came out of the ceiling of the open hearth department, and it has the word Cambria stamped into it. Coming back over this way a little bit, we also have oyster shell, and if you wonder what is an oyster shell doing in a steel mill display, in the wintertime, if we couldn't get enough limestone, limestone is needed as a flux to bond the slag together. If we couldn't get enough limestone, they would get railroad cars full of oyster shells brought up from the Chesapeake, because it can be used as a flux at that point also. The Johnstown plant produced all its own gases. We had three different gas plants in the Johnstown area, one in Lower Cambria, and I believe there was two in Franklin. And when you worked in the gas plant, it was a very dangerous place to work. Every tool had to be made out of brass when you worked in the gas plant. You could have no unintentional sparks happening in the gas plant. And if you were talking to a workmate and you were walking through the plant, you could not stop to talk. You had to move continuously, because if you stopped in a pocket of odorless gas, you were done. There was no reviving you. So when you worked in the gas plant, you walked the complete shift if you were not in an area that was designated safe to talk. Different furnace goggles when you're looking into furnaces and observing heat. These were clip-on goggles that went on different helmets. This was the superintendent's goggles of the open hearth department. His name was Joseph Sefcik, and again, his open hearth goggles, these are actually his goggles and his business card. This is a pen that came from a record set in January 1953 with 201,000 tons of steel produced in that month. And they gave out commemorative pens to the different employees. This is a Cambria Steel brass check, and again, brass checks were needed to get into the plant, especially during World War II. You needed identification. This is actually for FOH, Franklin Open Hearth, Cambria Steel Company brass check. As we come up to here, the Bessemer converter process preceded the open hearth process, and in our movie here at the Heritage Discovery Center, it tells how Johnstown was the birthplace of the steel industry. Up until 1867, we only knew how to make iron in this country. We made iron rail, and in the movie it tells that how they're trying to figure out how to make steel. Steel was a mystery back then, and this is from the Bessemer department. Once we discovered how to make steel, The only way we could do it was with the Bessemer converter process. This is a brass check from the Bessemer converter department. This is from a World's Fair in 1893. This was a postcard given out for the Cambria Iron Company display, and very rare to be able to have a Bessemer converter brass check. As we come down into this section, now we're getting into the open hearth department again, and this was the furnace number off of number 58 Doghouse. And what a doghouse was is you had your furnace on the one side of the furnace floor, and then all the equipment to monitor the furnace, to control the oxygen, to control the doors, to take the temperature of the steel, to get the analysis. This was all done with the aid of a doghouse. And every doghouse had a number on it, and it corresponded to the open hearth furnace that it was monitoring. This is where the first helper, you can see in the small picture, there's test spoons back there. There's lances to take different temperatures out of the furnace. But this was the only artifact we have left from the Johnstown plant of a doghouse artifact, and this was number 58 furnace. 58 furnace had a nickname of the hungry furnace. They usually gave 58, for whatever reason, easier heats to make that could be produced quickly. So these guys made a lot of extra money on tonnage out of that furnace, and that's why it was called the hungry furnace. Over into the mold yard. The mold yard department was right next to the pit. The pit was where you poured your ingots from the 150-ton ladles. There's a pit craneman. There's your steel pourer. There's your metallurgical observer. You usually had a pitman, and you had a slagger also on the pouring floor, as this crane is all holding 150 ton of steel. The ingots, there was two types of molds. One was called a 33 open top, and then there was what we called a sink head mold. And we also, at one point, for our plate mill, we produced plate ingots also for the plate mill. This was out of the mold yard crane. We had 4 cranes in the mold yard. The main cranes were 493, 494, and 495. And 495 was what we called the flailer crane. It held a device that would go down the empty mold, and it had chains. It would spin and it would flail all the scale off the sides of the molds. This is a small replica of a 33 mold, and in the picture you can see they're pouring 33 molds. Sink heads had a head that had an asbestos insert in it, that after the mold was filled to the top, a topping compound was put on it to keep it from cooling too fast, because what would happen is as the ingot cooled down, it would draw liquid steel out of the head down into the mold to make sure there was no voids in the ingot. This is a hoist crane from 495 mold yard crane. This is a diagram of the tongs that was used to pick up the molds and move molds around on the car. Usually there was 4 molds, sometimes 5 molds on a car, depending on what car. And on plate ingots, there was 2 on a car. This is a picture of number 41 open hearth furnace. It was the first furnace in the row of open hearth furnaces. Remember, they started at number 41 furnace and went up to number 62 furnace. A picture of them pouring hot metal. Hot metal came from the blast furnaces. It took 3 smaller ladles of iron for every heat of steel in an open hearth furnaces. So the iron came from the blast furnaces. It would come over in what they called submarine cars, and they would be poured into smaller ladles in what they called a hot metal station, and then they were picked up by the floor cranes and they were dumped by way of a chute into the furnaces. Again, 3 ladles for every heat of open hearth steel. Loading an open hearth furnace or charging the furnace was done with charger boxes. This is a miniature, and all the charger boxes, they were very big, and they were loaded in the stockyard by the stockyard cranes with different scrap and different, again, from the ore bins, different items that they needed to make the grade of steel that had been placed on order. They were called charger boys, and these guys, these were the ones that would take 1 box at a time. They would go into the furnace, rotate, dump it, bring it back out, set it on the car, pick up the next box. It took a while to charge an open hearth furnace, where in the electric furnaces we had enormous scrap buckets, and the lid would come off the furnace. They would charge 2 big buckets into the furnace. They would put the first one in, it would cook it down for a little bit, and then put the second bucket in, and that's what I did on the last day of production in the stockyard. And it was not a good crane to run. It was very, very busy. You barely had time to stop to even eat a sandwich when you ran in that crane, because these electric furnaces were pounding out the steel. steel. It was a very efficient way to make steel. I much preferred running crane in the mold yard or our gantry cranes than the stockyard. The stockyard was just not a great crane to run. Different samples of aluminum. A lot of times you need to add moly, you need to add nickel, you need to add a lot of different ingredients to make the heat of steel. Again, we were a specialty steel producer in the Johnstown plant, so we had a lot of probably very dangerous ingredients that we added in, but it was just what we dealt with because that's where we worked. The electric furnace melt shop again in Johnstown with the 2 furnaces. On our first electric furnace tap that we had, they made a commemorative cast sample of electric furnace. This again is a test from the chem lab, a lollipop test. Again, the last sample from the last heat of iron out of H-blast furnace, and here you can see a fully formed test. A lot of times they had 2 wings on them. They would break one wing off, and if it got misplaced or something happened in the test, they would have a secondary wing to break off. So a lot of times you'll see these with no wings on them. Sometimes they have 1. I don't have any that has 2 to it also. And an interesting thing, in a coke oven, it creates a lot of gas. And this gas cannot be vented into the community. If we can't use the gas in blast furnace production, you have to burn that gas off. And there was a very tall bleeder stack in Franklin and a very tall one in Lower Cambria. And a lot of times at night you would see the flame burning. Well, when they had to extinguish the flame for servicing or something happened where they had to shut that gas off to service some part of that bleeder stack or something was going wrong in the gas plant, they had to relight the bleeder stack once it came back onto line. And the way they did that was with a flaming arrow. So they had an archer at the Johnstown plant, and basically it has a place in the end of the arrow for a cartridge to go in that they would light. You can see these feathers are singed, and the archer would shoot it up at the stack. The flaming arrow would go through the gas, light the gas, and that's the way they lit the bleeder stacks in the Johnstown plant with an archer. To the left of the steelmaking display board below, we have a mud pitcher. And this was a commemorative mud pitcher that was given to the last superintendent of the Franklin Koch plant. His name was William George, and this was awarded to him in 1982. And a mud pitcher was used with sealing lids. You can see the picture right next to the mud pitcher is a gentleman that is doing the sealing lid jobs. And you can see that it's not an enjoyable job. But after the lids were placed onto the Koch batteries, a pitcher full of mud was poured around to seal the lid so that no heat escaped out of it. The next picture over to the right is a picture that was taken down from the Swank refractories. And it's a picture of a stopper rod and how it operated in a ladle to shut off the stream of steel when it was being poured. The later years we went to what they called slide gates that were hydraulically controlled with just a button. But the early days, a steel pourer really had a tough job. He had to have a lever, and he picked that stopper rod up out of the steel so that the steel would flow down through what they called the nozzle. The stopper rods were taken apart after each heat was pulled or poured, and then it was relined with new brick that came from the Swank refractories. That painting, that reproduction of a painting came from the offices of the Swank refractories that was down on Maple Avenue in the Johnstown section towards Johnstown of the Franklin Division. Next to it is the Johnstown plant, and it is the last heat poured. It's called last heat fax from the electric melt shop, again on July 31st, 1992. Number 20 furnace. The heat number, it was a 1050 grade steel. It gives the names of the pit Crayman, the steel pour, the metallurgical observer, and this is just kind of a document on who poured the last heats of steel in Johnstown. To the right of that, it is a board that as we came into the steelmaking division, they spent a lot of money making this for visitors to come in, and it was a very nice sign. It glittered. It had a lot of metal pieces on it that were reflective, and as the wind would blow and the sun would hit it, the the electric furnace, and as the steel poured into the molds, it would kind of glitter and shimmer, and it was really an attractive display as you entered into the steelmaking division. Below the pictures we have a brass wheel. The brass wheel probably came from the gas plant. All gas lines were painted kind of a lime green, a softer color green, and again, no sparks could be had in the gas plant, and these brass wheels were everywhere around those areas because you could not take a chance on an unintentional spark. We're now at the Franklin Mills division, and the Franklin Mills was the primary mills for after the ingots came from the steelmaking division. The Franklin Mills had two primary breakdown mills. The 40-inch mill was our older mill, wasn't used very much after the 1970s. Every now and again they would roll a heat through that mill with those soaking pits, but the main soaking pits was in the 46-inch mill. They were a defense purpose mill built for World War II, never to be torn down. They're now gone. But that was our most modern soaking pits. Everything in the Franklin primary mills is big. It's like steelmaking. Everything's big. Everything's extreme. Torches are enormous that you're burning large pieces of steel. And again, we're talking about 46-inch, 40-inch, 34-inch mills, so now we're handling big pieces of steel. This is a picture coming out of the 40-inch mill, I believe, because it doesn't look like the 46-inch mill, and I believe that's correct because I believe the gentleman does not have a helmet on. You did not need to wear a helmet in a steel mill until 1957, as odd as that sounds. Coming up from there is different stamps that they would use for the plate mill, and these are tongs that held those stamps. A lot of customers wanted to know the direction that the plate was rolled in. They wanted to know which way the grain was being rolled in that steel, so they would have a directional stamp that would be stamped into the plate. Steel prep was basically a billet grinding area that took flaws out of billets, and what you're basically doing in these mills is you're getting this ingot down to a manageable size that the smaller mills can roll into a finished product. Another brass check. This is an octagon brass check. This is an old one from, it says Franklin Works. It is a Cambria Steel Company brass check. Again, 1867 to 1923 when Bethlehem Steel bought the entire 12 miles of the plant. Above that, we have a 21-inch mill billet sample, a 4x4, and even though it's a square, squares were harder to roll because you think about if you roll too tight on one side, it's going to egg shape or it's going to elongate the square. So squares were kind of tough to roll, but that's basically what they did in the 21-inch mill as it went down through. This is a billet radius template that they would use the corners on, depending on what the mill wanted on radius on the corners. They would match this up to the billet to make sure that it was on correct size. This was a picture of the Steel Prep annual picnic. It was their 6th annual picnic on July 10th, 1991, and this is all the guys having fun at the Steel Prep Union picnic. In the plate mill was also, the 134-inch plate mill was also in the Franklin division, and it rolled its first plate on September 10th of 1902. It rolled different sizes of plate. It was an 11-foot wide mill, and thin plate was called skin. Thicker plate was called burner, and these are different plates as they're getting thick. The thick plate was called burner. This is a belt buckle that was awarded from the bar, rod, and wire division when we started back up. After the open hearth department, we went to electric furnaces. It was called the bar, rod, and wire division for Bethlehem Steel. This was a belt buckle for the primary mill's safety and maintenance crews. This is a patch that resembles that belt buckle that says it is, again, a safety patch. Again, our tongs that held different stamps, and we're coming down here into the 34-inch mill, still handling big pieces, and you can see the gentleman, he has a set of calipers, and he's measuring this billet as it's coming through, and he's shielding his face, because this is hot work. And many times they would put a stamp on it, or just to be making sure that the billet is on size. In 1972, the United States government came into the Johnstown department and ordered a special heat. Nobody knows what it was for, but it was for the military. And this is a sample as it went through the 21-inch mill, and the U.S. government inadvertently left this sample behind, and the gentleman operating the shears, he happened to take it home with him. So we have this special heat, and we don't know the grade of steel. This is a flag from from the electrician, and flags and tags and locks were used that if you were going to work on an electric motor, the main switches were thrown, you put your tag in here. Nobody was allowed to take your tag off of there. If you forgot about it and went home, you're coming back from home to take your tag and your lock off of that switch. Nobody's allowed to remove that tag but the gentleman that put the tag on. Coming down into our billet grinding complex, in our electric furnace melt shop, they spent $1 million plus on the state-of-the-art billet grinding complex. It used to be that you would manually scarf out what they called laps in the billets, where a piece of steel had rolled over onto itself, created a line or a crack. You had to grind that out so that the finished product, as it's rolling that 6x6 or 4x4 billet down, that crack is not getting longer and longer inside that finished product. What they did is, with this computerized billet grinding, the computers could see different cracks and different flaws in the billets, and it could automatically grind them out to make superior quality billets and to go down into the Gautier Division for finished products. Over here we have a hook, and this was to pull chains under lifts. You didn't want to put your hands under chains, under lifts of steel, so you would throw the chain under as far as you could. You'd reach in with a hook and grab it and pull it out, and then loop it around the lift and hook it on so the crane could pick the lift up. This is a tool from the plate mill, and this was used on the hotbeds, and this was to move different plates around to give it some guidance as it's coming down. If it's coming off the hotbed, you can push it back onto the hotbed as it's going down. And hotbeds were just basically cooling areas where the steel was allowed to cool. You didn't want to pick up red hot steel because you'll bend it, so it had to cool on the hotbed so that the cranes could bundle it together, send it to the shears, and cut it to correct lengths, and then pick it up and take it over and load it onto railroad cars to go to the finishing mills. Below the billet grinding complex picture, we have a sample from the 34-inch mill. You can see the hot saw marks, and there is a heat number stamped into that. Towards the bottom right-hand side of that, you'll see a section that's been milled out of that sample. And again, these were sliced off, they were sent to the lab. The steel was tested all along through the mills to make sure it was staying on grade, to make sure it was what the customer ordered. That billet would have been as long as a telephone pole coming out of that 34-inch mill, and again, they could roll rounds and squares in that 34-inch mill. Next to that is a sample that was cut off of a piece of steel that was on the billet grinding complex in the picture above, and that is a 4x4 sample, and we mounted it onto what is looks like a roller line, just like the roller line that came down through the billet grinding complex. The next item we have is a billet turner. Before the complex was put in for the steel prep division, a lot of things were done by hand. The billet turners were used. You'd have one man on either end of the billet as you were looking for flaws in the billets. You both would grab onto a billet and turn the billet over a quarter turn at a time to look for flaws in the billet. The next section we have is a display on what they called rail anchor. The Johnstown plant produced a lot of rail anchor, and this is a sample of the last bar rolled for rail anchor and a completed rail anchor. And rail anchor snaps onto railroad rail on either side of the railroad tie, and it keeps the rail from walking on the tie. And we produce these by the thousands in the Johnstown plant. These are tongs that they use to hold these sections of steel into the presses. It was a very loud place to work. Everything in Johnstown was loud. The machines were loud. That's why most of the time signals and things like that were done with whistles, steam whistles, because it was just too loud to talk a lot of times in some of these divisions. Below that we have just a sample board from the Gautier Division. The Gautier Division was one of the most diverse mills in America. It could roll over 1,000 different shapes at one time in the Gautier Division. Everything from steel window casings to reinforcing bar, and reinforcing bar was basically junk. If we made a heat that just nobody wanted, it was just off grade so much that nobody would order that grade of steel, it was always turned into reinforcing bar because it was just going to go down into concrete anyhow. Again, different types of window sash and window casing in the 1950s, steel windows seemed like a pretty good idea. We know now that it's a terrible idea because they sweat and they bring cold from outside into the inside of the house. But different types of T-sections and squares and rounds, angles, U-channels, different types of U-channels. And again, more window casing and different sections for windows. And then below that, we have a rail that was rolled for streetcar rail from the Cambria Steel Company. And this piece of rail was rolled in May of 1889. So this could have been rolled right before the Great Flood, but we do know the date on it is 1889 in the month of May. We're now at the Gautier Division of our displays. The first article that we want to point out is a brass check. But if you notice, that brass check is a lot larger than many of the other brass checks that are on display. That's because that is a surviving brass check from the Cambria Iron Company. It is the only one I've ever held in my hand. I've never seen another one. But this came from an excavation of a home that was built by a foreman in the Gautier Division of the Cambria Iron Company. And it was found during an excavation at a home that gentleman built. Below that, we have a picture of something called looping. And now we're into the Gautier mills, and we got smaller mills now, because now we're producing finished products. As the primary mills were the big pieces, these are smaller pieces being run through the Gautier mills. Again, one of the most diverse mills in America, with over 1,000 different shapes being run. This was a process called looping. And in those mills, as you saw at the outside of the displays in the vestibule, where we pointed out the rolling mills. These were spools that were set up outside of a rolling mill, and the bars would pass through, and a gentleman would grab it with a tong, and he would place this red hot bar into the next set of mill stands. This is continuing to feed. You have to hit that mill stand at the perfect point. You can't stop, because this is not going to stop coming out from behind you. Once this is into the next mill, this gentleman is standing in the middle. The only thing keeping him being pulled into that mill by red hot steel is a spool. The spool has a top on it that keeps that steel from jumping out over. There were several people that were killed. If that mill cobbled, or you didn't feed it in correctly and didn't get that steel underneath of that spool, it would pull you directly in and kill you into the mill stand. So this practice was later prohibitive. I did see guys do looping back when I was in Gautier. I spent 1 year in the Gautier mill when I was in plant pool, and we slowed down in steel making. They needed people in the 12-inch mill. I worked there for 1 year, but I did go down and watch them loop. And I don't know how you talked somebody into doing that job, because it was extremely dangerous. As we go through the Gautier division, again, the 36-inch mill was the smaller plate mill in the Johnstown plant, and it was powered by a massive steam engine that came out of a World War II steamship. And it was an awesome mill to watch run. The pistons and rods and crankshaft were out in the opening rolling, and they rolled the plate for the freight car division, among other orders. Above that is a sample of Gautier 14-inch mill bridge expansion joint, and below that is a sample of what we call mine tie. Mine tying was invented in Johnstown. It used to be in the coal mines. You had to lug timber into the mines to set your rail so that you could bring your mined coal out of the mine. This was invented in Johnstown, and basically with a sledgehammer you could knock the keys loose and take the rail up and pick the mine tie up and go to another section of the mine once you were done mining in this area. And this saved a lot of labor. It saved a lot of material cost in the mining industry with mine tie. All these sections were rolled separately in the Johnstown mills. A different brass check. This one again is round, much smaller than the Cambria Iron Company. It was from a gentleman that started in what they called the Looper program, which was for college students and temporary work to come into the plant. This was his brass check from 1965. Again, another brass Bethlehem steel insignia, probably off a lathe or off another piece of heavy equipment that operated in the plant. The 36-inch mill, again, this is the last order to go through the 36-inch mill, and the date on June 30th, 1977. This was an order for plate that was brought through that mill. And then back up to the 36-inch mill, they had set a record in 1942 in that mill, and it took them till October 21st, 1964 to break that record. That mill was destroyed in the flood of 1977, along with our 13-inch mill was destroyed in the flood of 1977. Below this order sheet is a roller's template, and basically a roller is the gentleman in charge of getting size on a product, and sizes get you to the finished piece. So you have different templates that you would hold onto different sections of the steel to make sure you have a minimum size and a maximum size, that these can be within tolerances, and that's what a roller's template does. Tag stamping hammers, different tags that were shipped all over the world. These were going to Manila. We shipped from the Gautier Division to everywhere in the world. The 12-inch mill was another Gautier mill, and it was the oldest operating hand mill in America until 2018, when it was finally dismantled. I worked that mill for 1 year. I was a shearman helper, I was a hotbed worker, and I worked on the furnaces, and then for a long time I operated what they called the roughing hook, which we'll show at a later time. This is after that mill was dismantled. They were a lot of whistles in the mills because it was so noisy. You had to communicate with toots on the whistle. So many toots meant to start the mill, so many meant to stop the mill. And this is the whistle that came from the furnace, and this is the bar counter. When you push a rod or a bar out of the furnace into the rolling process, you keep count. It wasn't a sophisticated way to do it, but you hit the handle, and it kept tabs on how many bars that you were rolling during that shift, how many bars came out of the furnace. As we come over, up at the top is a sample, another sample from the 14-inch mill, and this again was a small section for Goodyear, and below that is my father. He came out of high school and went directly into the Gautier Division in production scheduling. In World War II, he was an air raid warden. He had the authority to shut down the mills and shut down the lighting of the Gautier Division, and this is his credentials allowing him that. Johnstown was on Hitler's hit list. They did not want Johnstown to operate, so we were always in a state of alert as to an enemy attack at the Johnstown plant, and the air raid wardens throughout the different divisions were in charge of getting the lights off and getting the mills shut down in case we were attacked. This is a pin that's just a recognition, a National Security Award emblem for helping with the war effort. Different set of calipers, a small section of Goodyear lock ring for split rim. Probably this one was for a heavy 18-wheeler truck. This is an order from the Cambria Iron Company, and this is an order from 1896, April 16th, from the Cambria Iron Division of Gautier. And another section of Goodyear. This was for Goodyear, and then we come down into the last bars rolled in 1992 on the final shutdown. The 9-inch number 2 mill, this is a piece of lock ring, as in the Milestones and metallurgy. This bar was for carrier air conditioning. That's the last bar, the 12-inch rolled. And again, another section of Davis brake beam that was for the freight car department. That was the last section that the 14-inch rolled. Underneath that is the 13-inch mill. We also lost this mill in the 1977 flood. The 13-inch mill rolled mostly round sections. That was its specialty. There's not much in existence from the 13-inch mill other than this sample and a picture of the hotbeds of the 13-inch mill. This picture was taken on May 9th, 1961, and in 1961 we were in the Cold War era of between us and Russia, and we were rolling round sections for the ICBM missile launchers out west that they were installing in at a record pace. So this is a kind of a unique historical photo. Coming up from there, we have another bar counter, but this bar counter was from the 8-inch mill. Now we're getting into smaller and smaller sizes. The 8-inch mill rolled almost all the sled runner for flexible flyer, silver streak, any sled that people rode on as a child, the sled runner came from the 8-inch mill in the Gautier Division. This is the only artifact we have left other than a mill stand that we'll talk about in a little while, that will be coming back to the Heritage Discovery Center from rehabilitation, and that should come back in the spring of 2020. Going up from there is Cambria steel channel gauges for the different channels that we used to make. It would make sure that the width and the depth of the channel that was being rolled was correct with these gauges. Different types of hand tongs. A lot of the mills in Gautier were hand mills. They weren't fully automated mills. The 12-inch, the 9.2, the 8-inch. They were all hand mills, and these are different tongs that the people would use. And in our movie, The Mystery of Steel, you can see people using these tongs to maneuver steel as they did in the looping process. This is called a go, no-go gauge, and if the steel was rolling, you needed, other than a template that you had when the steel was cut off and sheared and you were checking it, this was while the steel was rolling. You could hold this. This is heavier material, and it was just basically meant to see if the steel was on grade as it was coming out of the mill pass, as far as the size of it, that it had its tolerances, and it was a go, no-go gauge. If it didn't fit in there, stop rolling. The mill needs adjusted down, or it's too big, it needs adjusted to a different size. The front gate of the Gautier Division, and again in that picture, and again a flexible flyer sled showing the sled runner that was rolled in the Johnstown plant, and another 12-inch mill. This was called the street side whistle. The gentleman worked the hook on the roughing side, or the finishing side. He had a whistle that he could, if there was trouble, he could signal the furnace not to push any more bars out of the furnace, that we were having trouble with getting a billet to roll. So again, different whistles was how it worked in the hand mills. And a matchbook cover, and it was from the Gautier Club. It was on Franklin Street, right outside the Gautier gate. Don't know where it was, but it does have an address of 136 Clinton Street, so it had to be fairly close to the Gautier gate. And it was just a meeting place for the gentleman to go after the mill shift, or after they had come off a 3 to 11 shift, just to go and talk about their day in the plant. In the lower section below the Gautier display boards, we have a section called Tools of the 12-inch mill. And this was a turn-of-the-century hand mill that operated from the early days of the Cambria Iron Works up and through November of 2018, when it was finally dismantled. So it did operate beyond Bethlehem Steel's ownership. I did work in that mill in the 70s. Again, during the plant pool selection, I got picked to go to the 12-inch mill. Had no idea what I was in for. And it is a tough mill with usually very big people that work in that plant. I worked there for about a year, and it was a very hard mill to get used to. It was heavy. Everything you're working with is heavy in proportion to what you're using to handle the steel. The hook that you see with the chain on it, that is a 100-year-old hook and chain, and that was used to grab the bars as they came through the roughing side of the mill, and then you would pick them up and put them into the next pass of the mill stand, and then somebody would grab it on the other side. They would slide it over into the next mill stand, and this chain was on a pulley and an overhead pulley system, and you would go, and there would be people at the end of it. When you would grab it with the hook, they would grab it with the different tongs and direct it into the next mill stand that it had to go into. You see what they called edging tongs, and the edging tongs were tongs if you had to turn the billet on its side, if it had to go in on its side into the next mill pass. The cup tongs that are below that were tongs that were used to grab the back side of the billet as the hook is swinging it into the next mill stand, and it was kind of in concert. Once you got used to it, you could make it work pretty efficiently. The problem is if you were new on this hook and you didn't have the rhythm down, the guys in the back that are holding onto the bar trying to force it into the next set of rolls are burning up, and they're putting a lot of pressure on you. And when the bar initially comes out of number one mill stand, it's heavy. Some of the stuff is very heavy in the 12-inch mill, 600, 700-pound brake beam, and when it's only about 6 foot long coming through the primary rolls, it's very heavy. Now, as it starts to stretch out and start to take the shape of the finished product, it starts to get lighter because it's getting longer, and you're stretching that bar out as you're rolling it down into smaller sizes. rises. After it left the finishing stand, then it would go onto the hotbeds, and then the last set of tongs is the hotbed tongs. Now later on they did put in automated hotbeds, but when I worked there, 2 people would grab a bar on each end, slide it across greased rails that would be smoking as you're pulling this hot steel across it to get it over to the shears, and then the shears would cut it into appropriate size. Above the hook, you'll see a sample from the last bar on November 16, 2018 that was ever rolled through the 12-inch hand mill. That mill now has been scrapped out and is gone. The next display board we have is a display board that commemorates World War II and the workforce in the Johnstown plant. At the top of the picture, we have a gentleman entering the Rosedale Division, and the reason I chose that picture was because it has the plaque on the gate that says Defense Plant, part of the arsenal of democracy. Johnstown was very important in the war effort for World War II. We were lucky enough to get a small caliber light exploding round that was believed to have been manufactured in the Lower Cambria Division. And below that, in 1942, the U.S. government was using up so much brass overseas in their machine guns that they asked the steel companies to start making steel-cased ammunition for the 50 calibers so that they could save the brass for different areas of the war effort where it was critically needed. We have a primary stamping, and then a secondary stamping, and then they were sent to the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, where they were neck down, primed, and loaded. But these are shell casings that were produced in the Johnstown plant. And down below that is a picture in 1942 of G blast furnace being relined. And it's interesting because on the top it says steel needed to beat the Axis. And it has a 23 days, I believe, left. There were 29 hours ahead of the 23-day schedule. So these are different gentlemen that were working, probably managing the relining of G blast furnace. As we move down into the 11-inch mill, this was Johnstown's moneymaker. The 11-inch mill was our newest mill. It was put into production in 1962. Again, ended production in 1992 with a commemorative bar. This was our money-making mill. When this mill went down for repair, everybody got on it. They wanted this mill back up and running. It rolled a lot of products for the agricultural industry, for the automotive industry, different samples of bars. And interesting, this mill was built on the foundation of the Bessemer converter building. So as you come under the stone bridge heading to the west end of town, the building that is now occupied by a defense contractor was the 11-inch mill. This construction began in 1959 and was fully operational again in 1962. This is a picture of that mill running, and you can see there's multiple mill stands and the pulpit operators that operate that mill. Each mill has to have its own speed set so that you're not pulling the bar from one mill stand to another mill stand. You want a nice arc in the bar as it's going between these mill stands, because if you're pulling the bar, that means that next mill is running too fast and you're stretching that bar. An unfortunate thing that happens in steel mills, in rolling mills especially, is what they call a cobble. And this is an example of a cobble. So remember, this thing could operate at 40 feet per second. When it was first starting to run the bar, this gate was down so it could direct the steel, and it went around and then headed into the next mill stand. If that steel, as it's feeding through here, doesn't enter that next mill stand correctly, or if it jams in that mill stand, it doesn't mean that everything shuts down instantaneously. It takes time to shut these mills down. So this turns into a cobble. This is the impact point where that piece of steel jammed or did not enter. It fuses into a mass of steel, and this begins to spiral wildly out of control. Cobbles are very dangerous. People are running when there's a cobble because this can shoot 20 feet into the air. A lot of times this would be picked up. In fact, that it was always lifted so they had at least a place for the steel to go out if it cobbled someplace in here, that it didn't start to spiral out of control back deeper into the mill. Next to it is a metallurgist stamp. The metallurgical department was constantly monitoring the grades of steel. And if he wanted a sample, he had his initials in there. He would go to the hotbeds or go to the shears and stamp it and say, I want that section. We're going to analyze it and make sure it's staying on grade. The 11-inch mill it could produce 3,800 pound coils. It was the largest in the industry. Again, another labor management participation team patch from a team member from the 11-inch mill. As we come up off of the cobble, we have tapered ring gear. This was a Ford product that was sent for Ford ring gear. Different brass checks. Again, unlike the Cambria Iron Company brass check that we looked at earlier, these are smaller, more modern checks, and these are Bethlehem Steel, Johnstown Plant. A round check was what normally everybody got into the plant with. When I started in 1974, brass checks had been done away with, and we had kind of a credit card with our Social Security number on it to get into the plant. Crane operator checks were normally triangular, and mobile equipment brass checks were normally square brass checks. And everybody had these brass checks in the early years to get in and out of the plant. 11-inch mill hat that was given out to the men that worked in the plant, and above that is a piece that was made by an employee from the roll shop department. With a steel mill, you have to have rolls to roll these steels that have the shape that you need the steel to come out in. We had our own roll shop. We were completely self-sufficient. Remember, in the Johnstown plant, we produced everything ourselves. We produced our own electricity. We produced our own steam. We produced our own gases. We manufactured our own rolls. We really didn't need anybody for anything else in this plant. We were completely self-sufficient. Mill whistles from the 11-inch mill, again, to signal for electricians and oilers and mechanical people, to signal for overhead cranes to come and pick things up. And below that, we have a sample of what we call jail bar. And in your old Western movies, you would watch how somebody would wiggle a bar back and forth, and they would work it to get it out so they could escape out of jail. The Gautier Division rolled something called jail bar that had two external wings on each side of it, and it had a sister piece that would go into door frames and window frames, and it would make it impossible to rotate this bar once it was in the other section that it fit into. Different tags were placed on trowel run materials. So if we had a new order that was being placed by a customer and we were making some trowel runs to make sure it was on grade and it was on size and the customer was happy, we had to make sure it was tagged so it did not get mixed in with production orders that were going out for shipment. This sign faced the stone bridge, and it was put up in 1962 when the 11-inch mill came into production, and we were very fortunate to have that sign in our possession. Below the 11-inch mill display, we have a display of wrenches. And the first wrench that is standing up is an interesting wrench because it was actually made by someone in the plant. If you look at it closely, it was burned out of pieces of plate. So if you worked in the steel mills and we didn't have a wrench a certain size, you made your own wrench. So that wrench has been cut out of different pieces of heavy plate and welded together. Moving down to the wrench right at the bottom, it's called a slug wrench. And you can see the hammer, and basically that was for bigger nuts that needed tightened or bolts that needed tightened that you couldn't get enough leverage on it with a normal wrench. So they had slug wrenches that had one arm on it, like that one currently shows, but I believe, since there's a lot of burn marks on the other side, that was actually a two-handled slug wrench where it would have two people hitting on it at the same time to tighten a nut. There were slug wrenches that were so big that overhead cranes had to bring them over, and you had to manipulate them onto big bolts and nuts that were high up off the ground if you were working on scaffolding on some of the big primary mills. And you would have a ram that would be held by the crane, and 2 men or 3 men would direct the ram and start pounding on the slug wrench to tighten a massive bolt or nut. Above that is different other wrenches. Some of them are curved, some of them were actually bent for specific use, like the small one. You can see it's got a 90-degree bend on it, so they must have needed to get into some place with it. So again, you modify your tool to do the job. The next section we have is our section on hammers. In a steel mill, you use hammers for everything. The first hammer that we have is with a long snout on it, and it was used to knock out bits in cranes that worked in the 46-inch mill and worked in the gantry crane area. And the bits were on the tongs, and what they were used for is when you needed to pick up an ingot or you needed to pick up a mold, if you had what they called a sticker in it, and you had to drop the mold to knock the ingot out of the mold where the stripper crane could not get the ingot out of that mold if it was stuck in it. There were bits in these cranes, and these bits would get dull. They would get rounded. They were kind of a tapered bit, about 2.5, 3 inches in diameter, and they would get pounded into the end of the tongs. When those bits became rounded and couldn't be used anymore because they wouldn't grip the ingot or the mold, you had to knock them out. So one man would stand with the ingot with the hammer that was used to knock out the bit, and another man would hit the back of that hammer with the sledgehammer to knock those bits out. The next hammer is not really a hammer at all. It's a copper piece that was used to protect sensitive parts, that if you had to knock something apart and you didn't want to damage that part, that hammer was used in a place as it was struck with another hammer to knock something loose. Above that, we have bricklayers' hammers that actually have Bethlehem Steel logo stamped into it, a tag stamping hammer that was used to make tags. When you had a heat that needed to be banked because you didn't have an order for it, you had to have tags on each one of the ingots with the heat number on it, so when you needed that heat again to roll, you could go find that heat that was in what they called the ingot bank. And that was up by the 46-inch mill. There was 2 gantry cranes. One was the big gantry crane, and the little gantry crane is what banked the heats. And the next long hammer, you see it has a clip on each side of the one end of it, and it is holding a tag, and that tag had a nail in it, similar to a concrete nail. And the craneman would bring over the heat that was being banked, one ingot at a time, and he would knock that tag into it to tell if it was number 2 ingot, number 3 ingot in that heat, where it was in the heat that was poured, along with the heat number. The next hammer was a blacksmith hammer that was used at the blacksmith shop, and then the final hammer is a smaller crane bit knockout hammer, similar to the one on the first part of the display, but with a shorter snout. The next display we have is called Toys, Rails, and Runners, and it's a display of different products that was rolled mainly for children in the 8-inch mill of the Gautier Division. The first section that we see is railroad track, and in 1926 Buddy L was much like Tonka, where they were building toys for children. 1926 they came out with an outdoor railroad, and for 20 foot of track and 5 cars the cost was $75, which was a very high price to pay for children's toys back in the 20s. But this rail section was all rolled in the 8-inch mill of the Gautier Division, the same mill that rolled all the sled runner. At the top of the display we have some different cast soldiers. In the summer months, the workers in the Lower Cambria Division, as they got extra lead, they had molds, and they would cast leaded soldiers to pass out to the neighborhood children during Christmas. Now we know now passing out lead to the children probably wasn't a great idea, but you were just being a good neighbor by handing these out to the children during the holiday season. Below that is another section from the Buddy L rail line, and below that is a piece of flexible flyer sled runner, again also rolled in the 8-inch mill of the Gautier Division. Next to that, we have a fence post, and this is believed to be the last fence post rolled in the Gautier Division. We believe it was rolled in the 9-inch number 2 mill, and the story behind that being retrieved is the division that painted these fence posts. It was a subterranean painting area that went down in through the floor, and it went through a vat of paint, and then came back up out of the paint into the dryers, and then they were taken off and loaded into boxes for shipment. A gentleman was working as a laborer back somewhere in the early 60s, because they had stopped this fence post production, we believe, in the late 50s, and they were getting ready to fill that whole paint area in with rubble to make more usable floor space. He was a laborer with a broom, and he was just to keep it cleaned up as the payloaders were dumping rubble into the pit. And he looked down and he saw a last fence post sitting down on the conveyor line down in this lower painting area, and he asked them to hold up while he would go down in and retrieve the fence post. He did, and that's why we have it in our possession now. It is believed the last fence post ever rolled out of the Johnstown plant. Next to that, we have a book that was produced in 1933, and it was advertising for fencing. We made fencing in our fence plant in Johnstown, and different barbed wire, different cattle fencing is advertised in there. And there's a picture of the Cambria plant where the fence is manufactured. And below this was a hardware sign for Bethlehem Steel Wire Nails. That was also made in the wire mill. And below you can see different types of barbed wire that came from the Johnstown plant. And 4-point Invincible, Conemaugh, Bethco, Cambria Perfect, Cambria Special. So even when we stopped producing barbed wire in Johnstown, they kept the Johnstown names associated with that style of wire. Next to that, we have a sign, and it's just a table of equivalent weights and sizes of wire, and just to give you an idea on what wire weighed per foot when customers were ordering it. Above that is a wire drawer's helmet. The wire drawers had their own color helmet, which was gray, and we were lucky enough to get one of these wire drawing helmets in our possession. The next division we have is the Rod and Wire division. It was a very diverse wire mill. It produced barbed wire. It produced fencing. This is an actual piece of 4-point Invincible barbed wire, and down below we have a shipping tag off of that same 4-point Invincible wire. You can tell this is an old shipping tag because the more modern tag said Johnstown plant. This was an older shipping tag that said the Cambria plant. Directly above that, we have different wire dies, and wire dies are used to draw the wire through. A very rare die up here is a square wire die, and it was for an order from Stanley Screwdriver, so it would pull square wire through it for a screwdriver handle. Next to that, we have steel clothesline. In the earlier days, before clothes dryers, people would have either cloth clothesline or steel clothesline, and this was called Bethenized, which was another name for galvanized clothesline. In the middle, we have a rare Cambria steel wire department brass check. Above, we have different gauges that were used, different diagrams and different things that was used, shipping tags that was put onto wire to let you know that it was a Bethenized wire or what kind of wire it was. Below that, we made a lot of steel wool in Johnstown plant. We produced almost all the steel wool, and it came out of steelmaking. It was called a wool wire heat, and it was in one of those 33 open top molds is what they made wool wire in. Next to that, we have a article that was in the Tribune Democrat. From the look of the car, it looks like it was in the 60s, and different products that came from the wire mill that went into everyday automotive use. A tensile strength calculator for wire is down below, along with a hook that was used again to draw chains underneath of lifts to safely be able to hook up lifts for cranemen to pick up and move about the plant. Above that, we have a Rockaway wire tester, and this was a primitive wire tester that we used in the lab, and it was used to measure how much pressure it took. The handle is folded up now, but normally a handle comes out of this, and you can pull down, and it takes and measures how much strength it took to begin to bend the wire. It was primitive, but that's the kind of equipment we had to test back in the early days. Below that is a mill cleaning stone. The mill passes would get scale on it, and you had to take a pair of tongs and hold this in while the mill's turning, and this stone would clean the scale out of the mill pass. A wire gauge for measuring diameters of wire. An old Cambria Steel Company wire and nail catalog. Below that is different wire drawing machines, and these happen to be Vaughan German-built wire machines that they're showing in that picture. On down the board, we have another piece off of a Bethlehem Steel Machinery, a vintage wire gauge. The oldest documented brass check we have, and this gentleman, his name was Andrew Kasser. He came from Austria in 1897, began working in the wire mill, retired in 1948 out of the same wire mill. Different types of tie wire that was used to tie up drop ceilings and things like that, and slinkies. The Johnstown plant produced all the slinkies in America, and this is a sample, a board that just 1979 tells that Johnstown plant meets slinkies requirements for our the slinkies. This is a commemorative Bethlehem steel slinky. This is a raw unplated slinky, and above that we had a BRW rod and wire division hat. And again, we said there was a rod mill in that, as we pointed out, up in the Milestones in metallurgy. And this is a picture of the last crew on December 15th, 1989, as they rolled the last bars through the 10-inch rod mill. This is called a crop end. A crop end is after it is put through the shears, a piece that's left over, it's too short, it's cropped off, it usually goes into a bin and they take it back up to steelmaking to melt it down, or perhaps the rod is getting too cold to enter into the next mill pass because there's a lot of water flowing over these mill stands. So if it gets too cold to enter into the next, they'll burn it off with a torch and get back to a hotter piece on the rod and start sending it through. Different types of rod gauges. Again, that 10-inch rod mill operated, was installed in 1955 through 1956. It had 23 mill stands. Rod sizes ranged from 7/16 of an inch and larger, and if you were in that size, you only needed 15 mill stands. This is the metallurgical sheet of the last rod. It tells the compounds, the metallurgical analysis of that sheet. Again, the same thing as we said, this was a leaded heat because it was 625 Series N 500, and this shut down the 10-inch rod mill. That rod mill was our only three-strand rod mill working, or three-strand mill working in Johnstown. Workers did not like working at this mill. It was in a tight, confined place. People did not like servicing that mill, and there was no room to get out of the way if there was a cobble or something went wrong. So guys generally did not like to work in that 10-inch rod mill. It was just a very dangerous mill. Again, that bar as it came out of the furnace on December 21st, 1989, that same bar as it came through number 9 mill stand, and that bar that day they only needed it to roll through number 15 mill stand. This is a section as it came through the final mill stand, and this is a go, no-go gauges. And in the early days we had a lot of immigrants, and they weren't able to use micrometers and use things like that, so they used go, no-go gauges, and just basically if it would slide on, you could keep rolling. If it didn't slide on, stop it, the mill needs adjusted. So a lot of the early immigrants that didn't speak English or could not use metallurgical measurements, they were given go, no-go gauges. Down below that we have 2 coils of wire, and just kind of keep in mind that this is a very small sampling of the coil, that they would be extremely big and extremely heavy, but for sampling and display purposes we have a small section of them. Every now and again in steelmaking they would get a bad batch of wire that they couldn't sell, it was off grade or something happened to it, and we would get a lot of this up into the stockyard to reload into the furnaces to melt it back down. And as long as it was bundled together okay, it was all right to load. But if the straps would break on it, then it turned into a real mess to try to load into either the charger boxes or even into the big scrap buckets for the electric furnaces, and you had to get a pulpit man out there with shears and basically it looked like big bolt cutters, and they would have to cut this strands of wire that was stranded all over the place. So you always tried to lower your magnet down about a foot or 2 above it and have the wire hop up to the magnet rather than grabbing it, and then it started to break the band. So there was kind of a trick to loading wire that did not make the grade. Next to that we have 2 different containers for nails. This is a 50-pound box. Up the top it says Johnstown, PA, wire nails, and then also kegs. We made our own kegs for these wire nails to be shipped in, and this is Bethlehem Steel, Johnstown plant, wire nails. And below that there is a company called PEM Industries, and these are different little samples of products that are made from Johnstown wire. And then during the bar, rod, and wire division, they actually went and put big signs like they did in steelmaking at the wire mill, and it had a clock, or it had the degrees, the temperature outside on it, and they kind of spruced up the entry gates into the different divisions. When nail production ended at the Johnstown wire mill, a lot of stock was left on the floors as far as boxes of nails. The employees were told they could take home whatever they could carry out the gate, so a lot of the nails were taken home for the guys to use in their own use. This is a sample of some of those nails. We made U-nails and different galvanized nails, and this was donated by a gentleman whose father and he himself actually worked in the wire mill. Below that is a badge. And this was it said electric truck operator, wire mill department. So it's kind of an interesting badge. Never saw one like that before, but we were fortunate enough to get it, and I don't know that there's another one. I'm not sure that badge was ever actually used. It might have been a prototype and given to the wire mill to see if they wanted to purchase more of them, but it is kind of a unique piece to have on display. I'm standing at a trade show display for the 10-inch rod mill. As steel producers would go out to the different vendors and different trade shows, they would display their products that they had for sale, and this was a trade show display for the 10-inch rod mill that would have been taken around through various venues to show the sizes of rods that the 10-inch rod mill could produce. Below that, we have our pattern shop display. When you're building a steel mill, you can't open a catalog and order parts. They all have to be made before you can make the steel mill. So the pattern shop, these guys were truly craftsmen. They started with blueprints, turned those blueprints into wood. They had to be master craftsmen at woodworking and leatherworking, because in the patterns they would be put into sand, and then the pattern would be left in the sand, and it would be cast into the part that was needed for the steel mill. So whether it was pulleys or whether it was piping or shafts, from small valves to big pieces like we saw in the entrance into the display. Patterns came in all shapes and sizes, and as far as the leather working, you can see in the patterns, you'll see rounded areas, and these areas sometimes have leather in them. You can't have a 90-degree crack point because that will shear off the piece when you make the finished product. So they had to be versed in leather working, so they had leather working tools, and again, to be able to turn these different pieces from blueprints into finished patterns that could be used to cast the parts. These guys were the true craftsmen at their trade, and it took many years to become a rated pattern maker. There was a lot of years of training, and we're fortunate to have some of these patterns that show the intricate shapes that they were able to produce prior to even making steel. These pieces had to be made to make the part. The next division we have is the freight car division. It was located in Franklin Borough, and it was the freight car division that made the gondola cars that was produced for hauling coal throughout the United States. One of the unique inventions we had in Johnstown was called the Bethlehem Coal Porter, and it was a gondola that had no doors on the bottom of it. It was a rotary dump car where it would go into a massive device at a power plant, and the whole car would be rotated over. It had no way to empty coal from the bottom. It allowed it to carry more coal because you didn't have the chutes located on the bottom of the car for emptying. Next to it is a tool that was used for the cars that did have chutes on the bottoms of it, and this was a wrench that you lugged around all day, and this is what opened the gates on the bottom of the conventional gondola cars. Below that, we have a painting that was painted by Mr. Ray Ciotti. He worked in the freight car division, and the painting is entitled Shift Change. Most of the railroad cars produced in Johnstown were riveted together. Later on, they did what they called huck bolting, but most of the cars from the early on was riveted together. You had a heater that was down at the base of the car, and he heated the rivets, and then he would throw them up, and the riveter on the top of the car that was on scaffolding, he would catch it in a cup, put it through the hole. There was a riveter and there was a bucker, and these are long rivet tongs, short rivet tongs, a different picture that was drawn by somebody that worked in the plant, and we were lucky to get a copy of it. And again, brass checks were done away with in the early 70s, and here's an example of a freight car division, a crane journeyman, and this was his credit card style for getting in and out of the plant. Different coasters, promotional products that was produced for the freight car division, and different types of brass plates. They made their own air in the plants. Remember, we made our own steam, we had our own compressor plants, and this was off an Ingersoll Rand 500 horsepower motor. Next to it is a builder plate from the 1800s off a steam-powered compressor. Below that we have what they called, there was the forge shop, and it was called the version press, and that's where it made different products for the freight cars, stamping out different sizes and shapes of items that they need to assemble the freight car. This is a hydraulic riveter. Again, on one side you had the riveter on the rivet. He was rounding a peening over the end. This has a cup inside this, and on the other side was a bucker, and he held the rivet in place with a heavy tool that held the rivet tight against the side of the car, while the riveter was on the outside of the car, riveting that car together. So you can imagine the noise if you were inside that car while there are 5 and 6 guys riveting on that car at one time. Coming up is a brass check. This was in a gentleman's on a gentleman's key ring for 55 years. And remember that mobile equipment checks were square. You can't see anything on this. It's all worn except for the number 554. And we know that he carried that for over 55 years. Coming up, different types of passes or business cards to get into the plant if you were coming in as a visitor. Up to spud wrenches. These were made illegal by OSHA. They were great for aligning holes when you were trying to align a hole and then tighten a bolt or a nut, but the problem was if you dropped it from up high, this was heading down towards your buddy point first. Probably a bad idea. Above that is a picture of the axle plant. Remember, the Johnstown plant made 80% of all the axles produced in the world at one point. Above that is the wheel plant. We produced the wheels for the freight car division. We produced wheels for different places that manufactured locomotives. It was actually called the Circular Products Division, and we made more than just wheels, even though the title name was the wheel plant. We produced nose cones for missiles. They were always spun on daylight. They were always spun with Pentagon officials around, and nobody was allowed to have a shred of steel that came off that nose cone. Everything was swept up, taken back to the Pentagon. Nobody was allowed to take a piece of the steel and analyze it to find out what grade of steel that was. That was all at the wheel plant. Again, different goggles, early stainless steel goggles, later goggles were now plastic in the 50s. Keeping in mind, here's pictures, and there's guys with ball caps on working in the wheel plant. You did not need a helmet in Bethlehem Steel until 1957. So you can see a gentleman at the axle lathe. He's got a soft ball cap on. So it wasn't until the later years when safety really became an issue in the Johnstown plant. This is called a knockout hammer. If a rivet doesn't peen over correctly, you have to burn the head of it off and knock it out with a knockout hammer and put a new rivet in. Different drift pins were used to align different panels in the cars. Reamers, there are straight reamers and curved reamers. Depending on if you're reaming out aluminum or steel, they're used to align holes in the sides of the cars. A different belt buckle that was used, probably given out as a safety award in the plant. As we come down into different drill bits that were used in the Bethlehem coal porter, down into a temperature gauge that was at number 4 air plant. It was an output temperature gauge. Rivets, we riveted with both steel and aluminum. Steel rivets were heated. Aluminum rivets were peened over cold. Below that is huck bolts. Huck bolts came on a little bit later. It's a pin and fastener system that instead of riveting the sides together, this is a fully completed huck bolt with some washers squeezed together, but basically a tool would draw this up and would shear the huck bolt off somewhere around here after the collar had been sandwiched, sandwiched to 2 sides of steel. Coming down past the pneumatic riveter, we do have an award that was given out for 133 days without a lost time accident. It's dated August 17th, 1960. Bethlehem Steel Car Department. The freight car division was a very dangerous place to work. I worked there for 1 week and went back to steelmaking. I did not like it there. There were too many ambulances in and out of that plant continuously. coming over to a stencil. Every car coming out of the Johnstown plant was painted with the Johnstown logo, built by Bethlehem Steel, Johnstown plant, and the serial number of the car. Above that we have different types of chipping hammers, from the very first wooden handled hammers to a little bit later with the wire handled steel hammers, and this was for chipping scale or slag off of welds, and then they went to air powered chipping hammers, made things a lot easier. Even when Cambria Steel owned it, they took their first order for a railroad car in November of 1901. Prior to 1923, they were already producing 50 cars a day out of the steel car department, which was amazing, given the old cranes and old equipment that they had, that they could actually produce 50 gondolas a day. This is a pay stub from a gentleman from March 7th, 1948. It was an 80-hour week. He cleared $108.36. You can see something called relief, where they took $1 off him. City tax was 14 cents, and this gentleman's name was Stephen Stem. And he had saved every one of his pay stubs. This happens to be the third one that we copied, just because it was in better condition. Above that is an adjustable wrench with kind of a unique handle on it. Not quite sure what it was used for in the freight car division, along with a typical welder's helmet for in the plant, and a wrench that was from Williams. Williams made most of the wrenches in the plant, although some spud wrenches did have the Bethlehem logo stamped into it. Down below this we have two awards, retirement awards. This gentleman's name was John Voyko. He started in 1922, and I believe April 26th, retired on April 30th, 1966 from the steel car department. That was his retirement award. And this gentleman's name was John Durnack. He worked in the wheel plant, and this was his retirement award. A poster of all the different types of cars that Bethlehem Steel produced in the Johnstown plant. This was also from the same company, Advanced Wrench Company, that made the wrench to open the bottoms of a gondolas. This was called a car mover. This allowed one man to move a railroad car. You would put it under the wheel, and a lever would come up out, and it would roll a railroad car. So one man could move a railroad car with this tool. Coming into the wheel plant, again, we have different types of calipers. Again, a photo of the last wheel rolled on September 14th, 1978. And again, different styles of calipers that was used to measure inside diameters and outside diameters on wheels. A book from the 1930s of different products, and you can see they did call it the circular products, but wheels and axles, and there's a lot of pictures in that book that show the Johnstown plant in operation. Next to that we have a brake pedal for a crane, and this was from the wheel plant, along with a warning bell. The cranes either throughout the plant had warning bells or sirens. Most of the steelmaking cranes had sirens in the pits because they were very, very loud, and even these bells, they were either foot operated or there was a cable that came down with a T on it, and you would pull it down and operate the bell if you were going overhead and you needed guys to make sure they knew there was something overhead. Many times in the freight car division, the short time that I worked there, you would be working, and all once it would get dark, and you would look up, and there's a railroad side being taken over your head by two separate sets of cranes that are holding one end on one side of the car, another crane on the other side of the car, and it was pretty unnerving to have your sunlight blocked with the side of a railroad car going overhead, but it was just part of the job. Different type of templates, just like you had templates in the mills for bar sizes. You had wheel flange templates. This was probably a smaller template for maybe a mine car wheel or a crane wheel that needed a smaller flange to it. But again, you would take, as you're making your products, you'd take a template and make sure, because this is a standard, this is the size you want it to be, so you're making sure your flange is meeting what the template says it needs to meet. The next display we have is signage from the Johnstown plant. There are lots of signs in steel mills telling you what to watch out for, where you can go, where you can't go, and what you should be doing in those particular areas. The first sign that we have is a very rusty looking sign, but it came off a number 4 pouring floor. That's where the leaded heats were poured. East of 4 was the lead floor, and that was posted on that floor. But very interestingly, our lunch lunchroom was right underneath the lead pouring floor with no filtration at all. So guys would sit underneath a floor that they're pouring leaded heats right above it. So I always thought that was an odd occurrence, but in the early days, that's just the way it was. Coming down through different types of high voltage signs, different signs, cleanliness signs in different areas. We have a sign that's kind of interesting, and it says, "Spitting on the floor is absolutely forbidden." This came from the main office of the head of Joseph Sefcik, who was the superintendent of the Steelmaking Division. So I found it interesting that he had to have a sign in his office that told people they weren't allowed to spit on the floor. Through going down through different signs, again, no smoking signs, if there were gases located in the area, danger high voltage areas, places not to enter, and the big black sign that says be alert to overhead cranes inside the EFM shop. That was the electric furnace melt shop, and they were right inside the doors as you walked in, because there was some very, very high cranes that held these massive scrap buckets. So you always had to make sure where you were walking that nobody was carrying something big over your head. Down below that, different crane. Every crane had a number. It had what the ton limit was, what the weight limit was, what it could pick up. That was a two-hoist crane because it has a 50/10. That meant it had a smaller hoist and a main hoist. Down below that, it says, do not make side pulls with this hoist. With an overhead crane, you can pull things to the side, but you can never have the hoist on when you're pulling a side pull. If you turn that hoist on while you're pulling sideways, it'll pull the cables up on top right off of the shivs, and now you're making the electricians very angry at you. So you can pull sideways, you can pull trains back and forth through the mold yard, you can grab molds, and you can pull cars back and forth, but you can never have the hoist on when you're pulling sideways on it. A hoist is for straight up and down and movement only, or you're going to get in big trouble. Down from that, there is a big sign that says, do not place hot molds or ingots on the 40-inch track. So that was our first older primary mill that we talked about back up in the Franklin Mill section in the primary mills. And obviously you don't want to sit anything hot on rails because it's going to lose its temper, and the next guy coming in with the heat is going to crack those rails. The last sign that we have down on the end under the railing is a sign that says Electrica on it. And to my knowledge, that was produced in the early days when immigrants were coming in to work into the Johnstown plant, didn't speak English, and so it's kind of a skull and crossbones with the voltage symbols there to let them know that if you can't speak English, stay out of this area, because you can get killed in this area due to high voltage. Our next display is our helmets and our clothing display. At the extreme end, you'll see an orange helmet. That's the color helmet I started in the plant with. Yellow helmets were also used widely in steelmaking and other parts of the plant. The white hats, obviously, they were supervisory helmets. The blue helmet was for bar rod and wire customers as they would come into the plant, and we would take them through to show off the electric furnace melt shop or show off the billet grinding complex. A lot of times there were observation platforms. The customers could come in and watch the steel mill in operation. We come back into an orange helmet with a full brim. That was a pit helmet. A pitman that worked in the pits always needed a full brim to try to protect the back of his neck from falling scrap that would be coming off of different molds or different areas that were overhead. The next one is from Mine 78. It was a Bethlehem mine based out of Wimber, and there is the battery pack attached to it with the light for visibility in the mining industry. Back from that is a Koch Plant hat. They were kind of a grayish brown type of a hat, a hard hat. Metallurgical is next. They were blue. Electricians were a darker blue. Another white hat from the rolling mills, and the green helmets were mostly steel steam and combustion gentlemen, fuel department folks. That one happened to be for a safety team employee. And under that is your jackets. At the extreme end, we have a raincoat with the Bethlehem Steel logo on it. The silver coat is a blast furnace coat. A lot of them were long coats that went the whole way down to your feet. When you worked in the blast furnaces, you would have silver spats that that would go over the tops of your shoes, leggings that would keep you from getting splashed with hot steel. The gray coat is a steel pourer's coat. We normally in steel making in the open hearth department and the electric furnace melt shop, we didn't have the silver coats. We had the heavy wool coats, and a lot of times those were full-length trench coat style that went down to your feet, again with leggings and shoe protectors that were worn. And then lastly, we have the Woolrich shirts, and they were produced in different colors of green. They had jackets, they had the blue shirts, and a lot of times you would see the Bethlehem employees wearing those shirts out in public. They had the Bethlehem Steel shield sewn into them, and people were proud to work in the mill. So if you worked in the plant, a lot of guys would wear those shirts just to go out and eat and go to restaurants and go shopping because they were proud of their job in the steel mills. And in closing, I'd like to say thank you to the Johnstown Area Heritage Association for allowing us the space to put these displays up. Also, thank you to my good friend Don Coslow for his help in building these displays, and also to the hundreds of Johnstown steelworkers that had artifacts in their possessions and their families that shared their stories on the artifacts associated with those stories. Again, thank you to the Johnstown area for helping us.